Think Florida's housing market already crashed in 2025? You haven't seen anything yet. Behind the palm trees and sunny headlines, a much bigger breakdown is forming in 2026. Prices are slipping faster, insurance costs are spiraling out of control, and homeowners are quietly getting trapped in properties they can't sell. Inventory is stacking up, investors are pulling out, and what looked like a small correction is turning into something far more serious. This isn't just another dip. This is the next phase of Florida's housing shakeup. Think Florida's housing market already took its hit in 2025? That was just the warm-up. In 2026, the Sunshine State is facing a deeper, more complicated housing breakdown, one that's no longer driven by hype, but by pressure. Pressure from rising costs, pressure from vanishing buyers, and pressure from homeowners who are running out of exits. Behind the palm trees, beach views, and glossy real estate listings, Florida's housing market is quietly cracking again. Inventory is climbing, prices are slipping, insurance is becoming unaffordable, and the investor money that once propped everything up, it's backing away fast. This isn't a sudden crash, it's a slow-motion squeeze. And as we move through 2026, some Florida cities are positioned to feel that squeeze far harder than others. So today, we're counting down the Florida cities where home prices are most vulnerable in 2026. Places where the warning signs are flashing bright red. Let's start at number 10. Number 10, Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale still looks like paradise on the surface. Waterfront condos, luxury towers, endless sunshine. But in 2026, the city's housing market is showing growing signs of fatigue. Inventory remains elevated compared to pre-boom levels. Listings that once disappeared in weeks are now sitting for months, especially condos built during the 2021-2023 construction surge. Price reductions are no longer rare. They're expected. But the real pressure point isn't price alone. It's insurance. By 2026, homeowners insurance in Fort Lauderdale has become a major deal breaker for buyers. Coastal exposure, flood risk, and insurer pullouts have pushed annual premiums into shocking territory. Many homeowners are paying thousands more per year than they budgeted just a few years ago. Add in rising HOA fees, especially in older condo buildings facing new safety and reserve requirements, and affordability collapses fast. Investors who once treated Fort Lauderdale like an ATM are reassessing. Short-term rental demand has softened, tourism growth has cooled, and returns aren't covering rising expenses. More investor-owned units are quietly hitting the market. Fort Lauderdale isn't crashing overnight, but in 2026, it's clearly losing momentum. Number 9, Cape Coral. Cape Coral's problems didn't disappear in 2025, they evolved. This canal-heavy city exploded during the pandemic boom, fueled by cheap land, aggressive development, and an influx of out-of-state buyers. By 2026, that growth is haunting the market. Inventory remains stubbornly high. New construction hasn't slowed enough to rebalance supply, and many neighborhoods are saturated with nearly identical homes competing for the same shrinking buyer pool. Prices aren't collapsing, but they're drifting downward. Sellers are cutting, buyers are cautious, and days on market remain elevated. Insurance is again a major factor. Flood and wind coverage costs have climbed to levels that make monthly payments unpredictable. Some buyers walk away mid-deal once insurance quotes come back. There's also a local affordability issue. Wages in Cape Coral haven't caught up to post-boom home prices, and by 2026, fewer locals can qualify even if prices soften. Cape Coral still sells the Florida lifestyle, but the math behind it is getting harder to justify. Number 8, Ocala was once marketed as Florida's affordable alternative. Space, quiet neighborhoods, and lower prices attracted buyers fleeing coastal cities. But by 2026, Ocala is dealing with the consequences of overconfidence. Inventory has ballooned. Entire subdivisions built during the boom are now competing with resales from owners who bought near the top. Homes that were once snapped up by first-time buyers are sitting longer, even with price cuts. Overbuilding is the core issue. Developers bet big on continued migration, but demand cooled faster than expected. At the same time, insurance premiums have climbed statewide, erasing one of Ocala's key advantages. Affordability has flipped. Prices rose faster than incomes. And by 2026, many local residents are priced out of the very market that was supposed to serve them. Ocala isn't a collapse story. It's a cautionary one. A reminder that affordability can disappear faster than people expect. Number 7. Tampa's real estate glow-up was one of the biggest in Florida. Corporate relocations, new towers, national attention. But in 2026, Tampa is dealing with a hangover. Inventory remains well above pre-boom norms. Builders delivered aggressively, and resale listings keep coming as investors and relocating homeowners reassess their plans. Mortgage rates remain a problem. Even if rates ease slightly, the jump from pandemic-era financing permanently changed buyer behavior. Monthly payments are still far higher than buyers were conditioned to expect. Insurance costs have also reshaped Tampa's market. Hurricane exposure and insurer exits have driven premiums up sharply, particularly near the bay and older housing stock. Investors are thinning out. Some are selling at modest losses. Others are holding but no longer expanding. That shift alone removes a major source of demand. Tampa isn't falling apart, but its days of effortless price growth are clearly over. Number 6. Jacksonville. Jacksonville enters 2026 with a fragile balance. The city expanded rapidly during the boom, especially in suburban corridors. Builders assumed demand would keep climbing. It didn't. Inventory remains elevated, particularly in newer developments. Buyers are picky, price sensitivity is high, and deals fall apart more often due to financing and insurance surprises. Jacksonville also faces economic headwinds. Logistics, shipping, and warehousing, key employment sectors, have slowed nationally. Job uncertainty directly impacts housing demand. Investor retreat is noticeable here too. Large rental portfolios built during the boom are being trimmed, adding supply to an already competitive market. Jacksonville still offers relative affordability by Florida standards. But in 2026, that cushion is thinner than it looks. By this point in the countdown, a pattern is clear. Florida's housing market in 2026 isn't collapsing because demand vanished. It's weakening because costs exploded while confidence faded. Insurance, taxes, HOA fees, financing. They're all working against prices at the same time. And as we move deeper into this list, the cities ahead face even sharper versions of these pressures, with higher overvaluation, heavier investor exposure, and thinner margins for error. Because the most vulnerable markets in Florida aren't just cooling, they're running out of room to absorb another shock. And that's where the next phase of this housing story begins. As the countdown moves forward, the story behind Florida's housing market in 2026 becomes clearer and more uncomfortable. This isn't about one bad city or one unlucky neighborhood. It's about markets that ran too far, too fast, and are now paying the price. These next cities didn't just cool down after the boom. They're dealing with layered pressure, falling demand, rising costs, and shrinking room for error. Number 5. Sarasota. Sarasota has long been Florida's luxury darling. White sand beaches, waterfront estates, retirees with deep pockets. But in 2026, Sarasota's real estate market is losing its shine. Inventory is sitting at levels not seen in years. Homes that once sparked bidding wars are now lingering, especially in the upper price tiers. Sellers are cutting prices, offering credits, and quietly adjusting expectations. The problem? Luxury demand is thinner than it looks. Many Sarasota buyers come from out of state, often relying on stock portfolios or home equity from other markets. In 2026, financial uncertainty has made those buyers cautious. Fewer are rushing to deploy large amounts of capital into second homes. Insurance is also hitting Sarasota hard. Waterfront and near-water properties face premiums that have climbed into eye-watering territory. For some buyers, insurance alone now rivals property taxes. That reality is forcing a rethink on what affordable luxury really means. And then there's timing. Homes are sitting longer than sellers expected, sometimes for months. Realtors are working harder. Negotiations are tougher. And price discovery is moving in the buyer's favor. Sarasota isn't crashing, but in 2026, it's clearly recalibrating. Number 4. Port St. Lucie. Port St. Lucie's story is one of speed. This city grew fast, too fast. During the boom, Port St. Lucie became a magnet for buyers fleeing high-cost states. New developments popped up everywhere. Builders couldn't keep up with demand until suddenly demand slowed. By 2026, inventory remains elevated. New construction competes directly with resales, forcing sellers to undercut one another. Incentives are common. Price reductions are expected. But the biggest issue is overvaluation. Even after recent softening, prices in Port St. Lucie still sit well above long-term norms relative to local incomes. That affordability gap limits demand, especially as mortgage rates remain higher than buyers were conditioned to expect. Infrastructure strain is another concern. Rapid growth has stretched schools, roads, and utilities. Traffic has worsened, commute times are longer, and some buyers are rethinking whether Port St. Lucie still delivers the easy Florida life they were promised. Insurance costs only add fuel to the fire. Coastal exposure and statewide insurer pullbacks have pushed premiums higher, eating into monthly affordability. In 2026, Port St. Lucie is no longer Florida's best-kept secret. It's a market searching for equilibrium. Number 3. Fort Myers. Fort Myers enters 2026 with scars that haven't fully healed. This city experienced one of Florida's fastest price surges during the boom. Investors, snowbirds, and short-term rental buyers poured in. Prices soared. Expectations skyrocketed. Then reality hit. By 2026, inventory remains heavy. Listings are everywhere, from condos to single-family homes. Price cuts are common. Deals fall through more often than sellers expect. Insurance remains the elephant in the room. Storm risk, rising premiums, and limited carrier options have made owning property in Fort Myers far more expensive than many buyers anticipated. Even homes outside traditional flood zones are seeing dramatic insurance increases. Tourism has also cooled slightly, affecting short-term rental demand. Airbnb owners who once counted on high occupancy are now facing thinner margins and tougher competition. That's pushing more investor-owned properties onto the market. Affordability is another challenge. Local incomes haven't kept pace with boom-era prices, and by 2026, fewer residents can absorb high monthly payments, even with modest price declines. Fort Myers isn't collapsing, but it's clearly correcting. And that correction still has room to run. By now, a consistent pattern has emerged across Florida's vulnerable housing markets. Overbuilding during the boom, investor-heavy demand that's now retreating, insurance costs that reshaped affordability, buyers who are cautious, not desperate. This combination creates a slow grind lower. Not a dramatic crash, but a sustained period of pressure. And as we approach the final cities on this list, the stakes only get higher. Because the remaining markets aren't just dealing with high inventory or rising costs. They're facing structural weaknesses that make them especially sensitive to any further economic shock, whether that comes from jobs, credit, or confidence. In 2026, Florida's housing market isn't about panic. It's about patience. And in the cities still ahead, patience is becoming very expensive. That's where this countdown reaches its most critical point, and where Florida's housing vulnerability becomes impossible to ignore. As we reach the final stretch of this countdown, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. Florida's housing market in 2026 isn't breaking all at once, it's bending, unevenly, selectively, and most painfully in places where there's no margin left for error. The cities still ahead didn't just ride the boom, they depended on it. And now, with buyer confidence shaken, investor money thinning out, and costs refusing to come down, these markets are feeling pressure from every direction. Number 2, St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg spent years reinventing itself. Art districts, waterfront parks, remote workers, luxury condos. The city became one of Florida's most desirable urban markets almost overnight. But in 2026, that transformation is being stress-tested. Inventory remains high, especially condos and investor-owned units. Listings that once sparked bidding wars are now competing on price, incentives, and timing. Sellers are more flexible than they'd like to admit. One of St. Pete's biggest problems is investor concentration. Short-term rentals exploded here during the boom. But by 2026, the market is saturated. Occupancy rates are softer, competition is fierce, and insurance plus HOA fees are eroding profits. Many Airbnb owners are realizing the math no longer works. That realization leads to listings, and lots of them. Insurance is another major drag. Proximity to water means higher premiums, higher deductibles, and fewer carrier options. For condos, new reserve requirements and safety rules are pushing HOA fees higher across the board. Affordability doesn't line up anymore. Local incomes haven't caught up with housing costs, and remote workers, once a key demand driver, are no longer flooding the market like they did in 2021 and 2022. St. Pete is still vibrant, still desirable, but in 2026, its housing market is fragile. Number 1, Lakeland. Lakeland takes the top spot for one simple reason: it has nowhere to hide. This city went from affordable sleeper market to investor favorite in record time. Located between Tampa and Orlando, Lakeland absorbed massive demand during the boom, and builders responded aggressively, too aggressively. By 2026, Lakeland is dealing with one of the largest inventory overhangs in Florida relative to its size. Listings are everywhere. New construction competes directly with resales. Price cuts are frequent, and demand isn't keeping up. Investor retreat is especially pronounced here. Many buyers who entered Lakeland between 2021 and 2023 did so purely for affordability and yield. But with rents flattening, insurance rising, and financing costs still elevated, those investors are exiting. A large share of listings are investor-owned. And investors sell differently. They cut faster. They undercut neighbors. They don't wait. That accelerates price pressure. Insurance isn't sparing Lakeland either. While not coastal, premiums have still risen sharply statewide. Homeowners are paying far more than expected for coverage, erasing the affordability advantage that once defined the city. Employment is another concern. Lakeland relies heavily on logistics, warehousing, and transportation. Those sectors are sensitive to economic slowdowns. Any weakness in freight or distribution hits demand quickly. Local buyers are stretched, new buyers are cautious, and sellers are competing in a crowded field. Lakeland isn't just cooling, it's correcting. By the time you step back and look at the full list, the story becomes clear. Florida's housing market in 2026 isn't facing a dramatic collapse, but it is undergoing a painful adjustment. The boom distorted prices, insurance rewrote affordability, investors inflated demand, and now the unwind is exposing which markets were built on fundamentals and which were built on momentum. Cities with diversified economies, limited supply, and realistic pricing will stabilize first. But markets overloaded with inventory, investor ownership, and rising fixed costs will struggle longer, especially if economic conditions soften further. The most important shift in 2026 isn't price, it's psychology. Buyers are no longer afraid of missing out. Sellers are no longer confident time is on their side. And investors are no longer assuming appreciation will bail them out. That changes everything. Florida will remain desirable. People will still move here. Homes will still sell. But the era of easy gains is over. And for the cities at the top of this list, the next phase of the housing cycle won't be about hype or headlines. It will be about endurance. Because in 2026, the Florida housing market isn't rewarding optimism anymore, it's rewarding patience and punishing overconfidence.